Well, Rachel, I've taken the literal meaning of a woman who needs no introduction because we're launching this podcast right now. No introduction, no preface. You are my favorite member of parliament, my favorite childless cat lady. Welcome to the 50th episode of Give Toke. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. And what a privilege. But also, congratulations, 50 episodes. That's absolutely incredible.
It feels pretty good. I think you were back with me somewhere around the early 20s, and that was when we both very shyly didn't really know each other. And I would say over the last year and a half, we've become firm friends. So it's really
Mm,
nice to have you here as my first return guest, but also as my 50th episode. So thank you for making the time for me.
my pleasure. Anytime. Anytime for you, Paul.
So we're going to take, we are going to treat this episode in a little bit of a special manner, given
Yeah.
that, you've hit 2 years in Parliament. So there's kind of an opportunity for some good reflection here. So it is really nice to have, your special thoughts here on what is a special episode for me. A lot has happened in the 2 years that you've been in Parliament. A lot has happened in the 18 months since I last had you on the show.
Yes.
And it was a real pleasure to have you on that show. I listened back and I listened to how, awkward and starstruck I was. But I thought about some of the standout moments and, I can imagine some of these things haven't changed. You really encourage people to be brave about their cannabis use to defeat
Yeah.
the stigma. And that stands out to me because I remember when you and I went to Green Farmers earlier this year to visit the facility, and someone followed us out after you had spoken to the staff there and said, I don't usually vote. I don't really care about voting. And, you're someone who I could vote for. So I think that's a pretty good launch pad, starting with the positive. Are you meeting people like this? Are you meeting people that are kind of sharing that sentiment?
100%. And it's always such an interesting conversation because I think that voting is not only such a privilege, but it's such an important part of contributing to our community, our society, as to what kind of world you want to live in. So, having conversations where someone says, I don't normally vote, but I definitely vote for you, is not only encouraging, but again, I'll use the word privilege. It's a real privilege to be in a position where your voice is reflected and respected by those who don't feel represented more often than not.
Yeah, I think more and more we're seeing that over the last couple of years. I think there's a bit of like, I don't know, compliance fatigue from post COVID where I think people are starting to realize, hey, I want to be represented a little differently. I want more broad
Mm,
views. And you've always brought that to your position. You're not a career politician. You have extensive experience with the real world, with the community. You've worked in corporate experience, you've worked for Centrelink. So
mm.
there's kind of an understanding of the people that maybe hasn't been coming through with some of our career politicians. And I really wonder, speaking of kind of career politicians, it's a bit of a pivot, but have you noticed a big change in the work you're trying to do since the switch from Dan Andrews to Jacinta Allan? Dan Andrews shared a lot of his sentiments about what needed to change about medicinal cannabis. Jacinta Allan has other priorities. What's been that experience like for you?
I think it has been a real shift, and I've noticed a shift with other members of parliament who work in that space as well. Not only do we see a shift in how leadership is structured, but also that collaborative relationship going forward has really been established there, I feel. We didn't know where Jacinta was going to land, particularly when it came to cannabis, and we had a firm understanding of what Daniel Andrews' position was when it came to medicinal cannabis and driving, for example, but he was firm on not wanting to support any sort of legalization or regulation of cannabis moving forward. So we didn't know where Jacinta was going to land when we first started meeting with her and building that relationship. But I think she's really established herself as a leader, and I think she's settling into the role really well. It will be interesting to see what happens next, but and it's something that I wanted to talk about today was just reflecting on drug checking services or pill testing. Now, there's been a lot of advocacy, say a decade's worth of advocacy and push here for what seems like no-brainer reform. And when Jacinta Allan came out on her own Instagram talking about, as a parent, this is my experience and this is what my fears are as a parent, I think it really resonated with people that she's not only living that experience as the premier of our state, but she's also reflecting on what are some of her fears as parents and relating that back to the wider community. And that was really helpful in her, I think, positioning herself, but also getting that positive reinforcement back for future reforms more broadly. And That real changing nature around drug law reform and how we're starting to see this rhetoric around harm minimization, around treating it as a health issue, not a criminal issue, that's all starting to really shift, particularly in the last 18 months since we last caught up on this program. And it's exciting to see for someone like me who has seen parts of Jacinta that are really quite conservative, and I had my reservations, but also seeing this side of her where she's very pragmatic. She's open to conversation. She was very sympathetic when it came to the driving issue around patients, and had a lot of her own constituents who are medicinal cannabis patients talking to her and relaying this fear that they had about driving. So, I think we are breaking down barriers with her, but we will see what happens next, I suppose.
That's positive to hear. I'm a little bit out of the loop because she doesn't have necessarily a full public stance the way that Dan
Mm,
Andrews did. You kind of knew that you could kind of set your watch to what Dan Andrews says, whereas Jacinta Allen's probably feeling things out a little bit more. But I'm
yeah.
really glad you raised the point about the drug driving, because this has been, probably the
Mm,
bane of your existence for your entire term so far. But we have had a bit of a win, as much as a few dickheads on
yeah.
Reddit want to want to challenge whether it is a win or not. It truly is. To summarize, basically from 1st of March next year, patients will finally have their day in court. Where magistrates' hands have been tied in the past for an immediate infraction, certain type of result in court, they now have the discretion to hear you out, and I believe the police have to prove your impairment issues. So talk to us about how we came to this. We're not all the way there yet, but it is a huge step, and I do want to congratulate you and David and thank you for the work of getting to this point.
And thank you for your advocacy as well in this space, because it does take sharing those personal stories and hearing from those that are most impacted to really change hearts and minds. But you're right, it has been something that has been our focal point from the beginning of when we both got first elected. I think David, it was his second sitting week in Parliament when he first read in the Road Safety Act amendment bill that would allow for a discretion for THC to be present in the system if you're not impaired. And, the outcome of that was that we were told there'd be a driving trial. We would be part of that driving trial, would be part of those conversations. And, there was this idea of it would be around an 18-month time frame, which would have positioned it to end about now, about the end of 2024. The reality of that was that it was a $5,000 announcement. It was going to be a closed circuit track trial. It's also going to not be resolved until probably 2026, which is an election year. And we just couldn't settle for that. We felt really defeated by the government, and somewhat tricked, I suppose, that this was something that we thought we were collaborating on, something that we thought the government understood the plights of patients and their need for some sort of, I guess, concession, but a regularity around the laws and not being criminalized for something that they are accessing, which is a legal product. So having this position of we need to do something more and we need to represent these patients was something we couldn't let go of. And landing with the government, we had to take baby steps during this last 12-month period. But as you know, we brought a motion before the Parliament in July, which was to say, look, we need to do something in the interim. They gave us, I guess, a response back, which was, we'll go and find an eminent person to write a report for us. We want to hear what all the experts say. So we want to hear what the criminal justice system says. We want to know what the lawyers are saying. We want to know what the police are saying. We want to know what the health professionals are saying. We want to know what road safety is saying. And Tony Parsons, who's a former drugs court magistrate, was our eminent person and a delightful person to work with. Tony made sure that doors were opened and he had those conversations. And what came back was this, I guess, overarching position from all of these stakeholders, which was that the laws aren't fair and that they are discriminating against people who are ordinary Victorians taking their medication as prescribed, yet there is a real fear that and people were being prosecuted uh, because of their medication they were taking. So the report was handed down, and would luck or timing or whatever the universe had given us at that time offered, but a road safety bill, an omnibus bill as we will call it, a bit of a bill that would do a bit of everything to road safety was coming before Parliament, and we were able to put an amendment to that, which was to allow for magistrates to have that discretion, that it would no longer be an automatic loss of licence, that it would be a consideration that you are a medicinal cannabis patient, and that yes, if you're not impaired when you're driving, that the magistrate has that discretion to say, we are not going to suspend your licence. We can see that you're a patient.
It's a huge win, and obviously the end goal is still, roadside discretion and beyond. We want to go further than this, but
Yes.
it is something to celebrate, and it's a huge deal. To play devil's advocate, I assume there are really good reasons. Why March 1st? Why is the general public waiting till then?
That's a good question. It was something that we raised as well. I think if the government had it their way, or actually probably more likely the road safety and transport departments had their way, they would have made it probably the middle of the year next year. So we did really push for this to be as soon as practical. It takes time to educate the police. It takes time to make sure that those who are in roads and road safety are also on board. And it takes time to make sure that the magistrates and the judiciary are on board as well. So it's essentially about educating and of the changes to the law and making sure that there are appropriate mechanisms in place to administer that change.
It makes perfect sense. I think sometimes people live in a little bit of a bubble where if they know something, they expect that it's known by the wider community or known by, the police or the government. But I think that's a really good point. It's going to take some time to make sure that everyone knows what their job is now. So that makes sense. And thank you for explaining. And I think it's nice even to hear in there that it could have been a little bit later. So we should be happy with March 1st.
Exactly. And look, I'm a medicinal cannabis patient myself. And, I live in the South-East where I at least once a week drive past a RDT bus. They like to target particularly my local area of Frankston and Seaford. So, I hope that they're not hanging around anymore because it's just one of those things where you think, what is their intention here? And talking to police officers, they say, well, we're here to test presence, not impairment. And I think this sort of puts the notice back onto them to say, well, you do have the ability to test impairment. We only test for MDMA, methamphetamine, and THC. So if someone's presenting and they're clearly impaired on maybe another type of medication, which we know is often the case, or something like cocaine, for example, the police would have to do an impairment test. And this ability of the magistrate falls short. If someone is actually charged with impairment, then this doesn't apply. If you're impaired, you shouldn't be on the road. It's as simple as that.
And that is, obviously the big kind of underlying sentiment to remind some people that are resistant to this that we're not wanting people, blazed out of their minds on the road. We want patients, legitimate patients who are prescribed by a doctor to have the same experience as other medicinal patients for other
Mm.
substances in Australia. So,
Yeah.
no, fantastic work. Obviously, still, a ways to go with the closed circuit trial between Monash and the government, but certainly something to kind of keep us going, keep the spirits high in the meantime, as we wait for the rest of the country to catch up and
Yeah.
South Australia who have fallen way behind to move along as well.
Yeah, and I think what was interesting coming out of this whole debate, and when we did put this amendment to the Road Safety Act, you often expect that, we worked with the government to garner their support, but we also worked with many of the crossbench to make sure that we also had that fulfilling support there as well. But we'll work with anyone in politics, and even the opposition, the Liberals Nationals coalition, was supportive of this amendment because even they can identify the evidence was there and that this was unfair and needed to change. So it may only be an interim measure until that driving trial is completed, but we kind of have a sneaking suspicion what might be the outcome of that driving trial because we've seen many trials like this replicated in the past. So one would hope that once the driving trial is completed, we would see more rigorous legislation in place that would probably be either similar to Tasmania or it may even go further, that there's some sort of an exemption there for patients. We know that the driving trial is also looking at measuring impairment more broadly and what kind of tools we use to measure impairment, which is also something that's really important for cannabis law reform going forward. So it's all part of the bigger picture.
Definitely. And, there's commitments that I'm willing to make as a patient, like, zero BAC, blood alcohol content, things like that. Like, there's compromises that we can make to get this over the line. But I do want to focus on one thing you said. And, folks, you heard it here first. Rachel Payne says the Vic Libs are all right.
When it came to this, we were so shocked. And what we actually realized was this meant a lot for reform in other states. Working with the government of the day, which in Victoria is the Labor Party, means that, we can kind of see what might happen more broadly in other states. But when you've also got the bipartisan support across the board, it gives a little bit more wriggle room for other states where there may be, a Liberal Party in power. So who knows? Who knows what might be the outcome, but good on them.
Well, yeah, again, thank you so much for your tireless work on that. Thank you to David as well, and everyone that's involved in that, because it is a huge win for medicinal patients. I think it's a good segue to take stock of the last couple of years as a whole, because I do think you've probably been bogged down very heavily by driving whilst working on a hell of a lot of other things. You know, you alluded to pill testing earlier and that kind of increasing safety in the community. So looking back at 2 years in Parliament, is there a moment or achievement that stands out to you the most, and why?
So much has happened in the last 2 years, and it has been a total whirlwind. But David and I were talking the other day about how we feel like we're finally getting the momentum and understanding how this place works. When we talk about Parliament, we say this place. I would have to say that some of the achievements that are most notable for me is that, and I mentioned this before, we're really starting to see a change in the rhetoric around personal use. I think that we are starting to get momentum in that space, and I'd love to talk more about what that is going to look like next year. But also, when it came to industrial hemp, we saw some really good steps forward as well. So I headed up a motion that looked to getting an inquiry before Parliament. We find the best way to get anything before Parliament and make it sort of more rigorous is by having evidence behind you. So, by doing an inquiry, a report is produced, recommendations are made, and then you start to use that as a way to springboard into either legislation, which I did bring forward for hemp, but it's also a really good way to engage with the minister and the department that are involved as well. And they respond to these inquiries and those recommendations. And we saw that support was given in principle for most of the recommendations that came out of the hemp inquiry. And hemp for me is an interesting one because if you can't talk to someone about cannabis or if they're quite anti cannabis, you're more likely to have a pretty positive conversation with them about hemp. So it's always a good way for me to continue advocating in the space. And I'm such a firm believer in hemp. I'm wearing a hemp shirt today that has cannabis leaves on it, particularly just for you, Paul, for today in our show. But yeah, I think that going forward, I would love to see standalone legislation for hemp. It should be treated as it is deserving of, as its own crop, as a future crop, and given the glory that it is. I say it's a golden ticket for the government, and they should take us up on that one. So I'll keep pushing for that next year for sure. But definitely the drug checking services and the collaboration with other members of parliament on that. So I worked with Georgie Purcell from the Animal Justice Party and Ave Puglielli from the Greens on a joint bill, pardon the pun, that was to instill pill testing, not only a fixed site service, but mobile testing at festivals. And this was obviously in response to the catastrophe that was last year's festival season and how many people we saw fall ill or lose their lives. So it was really good to collaborate with other people, and sometimes things are just way above party politics, and it's about coming together on a cause that you all believe in, and that created a really good momentum. This time last year, we were sort of spending a lot of time talking to the media and showcasing this issue and really pushing for reform. And it was at that point that the Premier, Jacinta Allan, did actually come forward and say, I need to look at the evidence here, which is a big step forward from what Daniel Andrews was saying only 12 months previously. So and here we are today that pill testing is now a reality. It is about to start at the end of this month at its first festival here in Victoria, as well as a fixed site will be established mid next year. So I'm all for keeping people safe. I'm really terrified at how many novel substances are around. I mean, nitazines are so powerful and very scary in comparison to heroin and fentanyl, which we have many fears about in the community. So it's about keeping people safe. It's not about encouraging people to take drugs. It's about people being educated about the drugs they take.
Well, I think if, kind of take a reality check of, I don't know if you've heard the phrase in shitification, where like the quality of our goods and services are declining as prices go up.
Yeah.
And if you get out of your bubble, if you're not someone who knows drug users, you need to realize that it's happening to drug users as well. The quality of their
Yeah.
drugs is declining, the price is going up. And the quality of drugs declining usually means that your life is more in danger. It's not higher quality goods or different kinds of goods that are going in there that are safe. It's things that
Yeah.
are more harmful and potentially more dangerous. So this stuff
Mm.
always comes from a place of harm minimization. Societies have people that use drugs. Societies have people that need drugs for various reasons. And instead of prohibiting them from accessing safe services, we provide them, and therefore we hope we save lives, educate people better. So that is huge. And I've got to
Mm.
say, it's very cute, not to be condescending, watching you, Georgie and Ave, in your sunglasses, getting together and teaming up. There's great vibes there.
And we would have the line, if you know, you know, because people would say, "Why are you wearing these sunglasses?" As most people who take drugs would know, they're affectionately known as speed dealers.
Yeah.
So we would just say, "If you know, you know," and we'll leave it at that. But as something it turned into something that, from something that was part of being a bit cheeky and having a bit of fun with the campaign, to something that became quite iconic, as the kids would say.
Definitely. I do really appreciate the ability that you seem to have to work with people, across the floor, on the crossbench, in other parties. It does
Mm.
seem to be, a very good string to your bow and a desire to make sure that you have impact. What have you done to make those compromises? What have you done to build those relationships? Because it does seem that it's important to you to have meaningful relationships with your quote unquote adversaries.
100%. And I find that if I'm just speaking to people who agree with me all the time, I'm not really elasticizing my brain in a way of nuancing my conversations or my arguments. But it's also often decisions come from a place of fear. And I think that when you start to unpack why people might be resistant, particularly, say, for example, to cannabis reform, it's often that they've had someone in their life or they themselves have had a bad experience. So acknowledging that and trying to understand where that position is coming from is really important to me. But it's also, I don't want to be in an echo chamber of people who just agree with me. I like being challenged. I like learning from different people. I like the fact that sometimes my opinions do change. And I often can also see that those that oppose me have their minds opened and their opinions do change upon occasion as well. So I think it's all just part of politics, though, as well. And it's part of being part of a broader society is that you're not going to always get along with everyone. And if you do, maybe you need to open up your world to other people and sometimes have uncomfortable conversations because it's something that I feel like is really lacking in what we're trying to achieve going forward.
Yeah, I was listening to a Mark Manson podcast just last night, actually, about kind of conflict and cutting people off. It seems to become something that's a little bit more prevalent, a little bit more possible these days because, this person doesn't have the idea that I like. I don't agree with them, whatever it might be. There's been very polarizing public sentiments over the last 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's become quite easy to be like, you know what? I don't agree with that person, so I'm never speaking to them again. And sometimes I fall, I'm guilty of those things. I remember in my 20s, I used to have this phrase, from conflict comes opportunity. That almost
Yeah.
disgusts me now, where I run from conflict, where I'm like, I can't be bothered with that person and their bad ideas. But ultimately, we do benefit from being around different people. And I'm wondering if your views on either politics or governance have kind of changed in the 2 years you've been in Parliament.
Oh, for sure. I mean, so much has changed in my mind since starting in this role. And I think for me, it's essentially around not just that polarization, but also how people are interacting more broadly. And I think some of the biggest challenges that I do face is I'm representing a topic that is often very stigmatized. And I'm quite used to doing that, particularly with previous jobs that I've held. But if you start to shift that focus into what can we learn from each other, I think that the message and the dialogue really does change as well. Relationship building has been really important for me. So building those relationships with people who I wouldn't ordinarily think that I could have a working relationship with has been really important. And I have learned a lot from that experience. But some of the biggest challenges for me has been I like to be a very organized person, and you can be as organized as you like in politics, but you also have to be able to pivot. So my dance shoes have been taken off the rack and been put back on upon occasion, and I do have to pivot more often than not. But it's about being flexible with change, and it's about having that ability to handle all those moving parts that are politics. Often it's about timing. Often it's about those relationships that you've established. Often it's about, you know, is there something that you have to offer, and is there something that you can receive? So that's probably the biggest lesson I've had to learn, to pivot.
Something that I heard recently on John Oliver, which changed my mind about politics, was that you have to accept that politics is transactional. You can be righteous about certain things, but at times you also need to make compromises. So, have you found that that's something that's going on?
Most definitely. And I think compromise came in, referring back to the driving trial. We definitely had to compromise when there was this announcement around the driving trial, because it was almost expected that we would want to be part of that public announcement. And there was no way we're going to stand there with the government saying, yes, we're going to do a driving trial and it won't be done until we kick it down the road. We just felt devastated, particularly not only for our people, but for those that are impacted on the ground in this space. And I think that compromise came about with, well, how can we be creative here? And that's where the position came of, well, what can we do in the interim? And listening to what the magistrates were saying, and in particular working with the wonderful Tony Parsons, he relayed a lot of his own personal experiences of being a magistrate and saying, look, I'm so sorry. I can see that you are a legitimate patient. I can see that you're in severe pain and that this has been something that has helped you. And my hands are tied. I have to suspend your license. I have to relay this decision. So not only did I say to him, I bet you slept well last night once the agreement was finalized and it went through Parliament, and questions were responded to and everyone voted and it was all hunky dory, tickety boo. I think it was also that, there was that compromise there around, well, this is something that we can get in the interim. And I feel as though learning that ability to not only compromise, but work with those that are not necessarily those in front of you, but reaching out to those experts, those stakeholders, those that are in a position of authority, or that level of expertise that is beyond politics, and just making a reasoned assessment and presenting that to members of parliament and those that are in those positions of power really has helped, I think, move that dialogue as well.
It reminds me of David Halpin, who's also, dedicated his post-work life to, being involved in organizations like Drive Change, who are trying to get these laws changed as well. There's
Yeah.
there's people from all sides of the spectrum that are sick of this, that are sick of the status quo. And so it's a relief to know that, the team is building. The crew is getting stronger. There's more important people in it. There's we're getting away from just us stoners, and we're stepping up
Yep.
to people with higher standing in society, as it were.
Well, and this is one of the things that I do realize, being in the cannabis space, is there's no such thing as a typical cannabis user.
Bang on.
I mean, look at us. I mean,
Look at that
but in
shirt.
saying that, I know, I think they can
Magnificent.
see me coming. I walking out to get my coffee today, I did get a lot of interesting looks and some nice little winks as well. So, and that's cannabis for you.
Yeah.
I mean, if I wear my Legalise Cannabis t-shirt down the beach, I get so many, hey, I love it. But yeah, there is no cookie cutter position as to what a cannabis user is. And I like the fact that that has really shifted predominantly over the last few years. And I think since COVID, it's really shifted.
Not long after, we got to know each other, you moved from, quote unquote, my side of town to your actual
Yeah,
electorate, living in
yeah.
Seaford now, which looks absolutely
Hmm.
amazing. And I can't wait to
So
get the
gorgeous.
kayak and stand up paddleboard out there this summer. Can't wait.
100%.
I'm curious, what are the issues facing your electorate today? What are the kind of the bigger picture issues you deal with? David is in my
Mm,
electorate, and one of the big
hmm.
things is buses over here. That's a huge
Yeah.
issue, public transport in the West, and I'm so glad to see him fighting for something, other than cannabis, as you guys do. So, what's
Yeah.
facing you in your electorate and the people that live on the southeast side?
And I think people often forget that when you're talking to, say, someone who just predominantly wants to see you there representing cannabis. Of course, this is what I'm elected to do, and that's my main focus. But I'm also a representative for the South-East and Metropolitan region, which is roughly around just under 600,000 constituents. Now, I moved into my electorate office in April this year. It took them a little bit of time to find me a space. So I thought, well, social media is not my friend. I can't let everyone know I'm here via social media. But why don't I do a mail out and survey people and say, what are your biggest issues? And overwhelmingly, what came back was cost of living. It is mortgage stress. It is rents are increasing. It is food insecurity. And I dare say that's across the board throughout this state, if not across Australia. But some of the things that I've tried to focus on in supporting that have been looking at, for example, housing affordability and looking at the government incentives around getting people into their homes or into their first homes. And we're seeing that the state government had an incentive for first home buyers where they would allow a subsidy. Now that is going to be offered by the federal government. Now there's a real shortfall there between what your income can be if you're entitled to one and not the other. So I've been really pushing for there to be some sort of connection there around how are we supporting particularly young people getting into housing. But I also took it a little step further and I thought, we do not respect or do not pay enough homage to our essential workers in this space. And we are seeing all these so called activity centres pop up, which is where we're allowing major development to come in. We would love to see that a part of that is not only social but affordable housing as well. And what I'd love to see is the government incentivise our essential workers, our teachers, our nurses, our healthcare professionals, our AMBOs, offered some sort of subsidy by the government to get into housing that would mean that they're living close to where they're working. Because we know that our essential workers are not paid enough. They should be supported more by the government. They should be treated like the angels of society that they are and respected, but also it creates community having people living in a space all together that are from all different walks of life. And I would love to see, to me, it's really sensible reform, but this is something that I'm sort of pushing for going forward. And we don't want to see our essential workers burning out. And if they live close to where they work and have access to affordable housing, for example, Frankston Hospital is about to be built. Frankston is going through a really dynamic shifts and changes around redevelopment. I would love to see a portion of development there just designated for essential workers where it was subsidised by the government that they would be afforded that housing.
I absolutely adore that. That speaks to me on a personal level, being a school teacher myself. In my 20s, the last thing I wanted to do was bump into kids and families on the weekend. But, now that I'm in my 30s and I live near the school that I work at, it's an absolute delight to live in that community. I know the restaurants where people eat. I know the restaurants that families own or the shops that they own. I run into kids at the supermarket. I can give parents feedback about their kids' performance, just kind of on the fly. And I think that's really
I love
lovely.
that.
On the flip
Yeah.
side, I have colleagues who are coming from the other side of town who are getting 2 trains and a bus and things like that. They're not engaged with their community. They're tired before they even get to work.
How exhausting.
And I
Yeah.
just think, I wouldn't say I've taken it for granted, but I certainly really, looking at that now, I think about how grateful I am to have had this experience over the last few years where I get to work and live in the same place, because that's quite rare. Usually you're commuting, usually you live out of town and you're coming into town or whatever it might be. So I think that's what the people deserve. And I can say that that's something
Yes.
that's made my life have more, quality and more vibrancy. So that's really great and impressive work.
Thank you. There's lots to happen in the southeast, so and it's a really dynamic and diverse community. So, I'm really enjoying sinking into the role and learning more about the community that I'm representing, but also looking at parts of community that are underrepresented. And obviously, I'm a LGBTIQ person. I identify as queer. Having that representation, even in the southeast, for me is really important to make sure that I'm spearheading a lot of those conversations and standing up and looking at things moving forward that do impact our community and being visible in my community in that space as well.
I'm glad you raised that. So over the last year, my podcast has grown significantly. Like I'm very proud of the audience numbers. The listenership is really great. What I have noticed is I haven't lost female listeners, but I have significantly gained male listeners to the point where it's a 75 to 24% split. It used to
Wow.
literally be 50-50. A year ago it was 50-50.
Yeah.
In my Spotify Wrapped, I saw that people that listen to my podcast listen to Joe Rogan, they listen to the Alpha Male podcast, they listen to Diary of a CEO, they listen to Theo Von. These are all things that I don't necessarily connect with. It might be a bit of a softball for you and I, but I think it's important that some people hear this. Why is the voice of underrepresented groups so important to defining where Victoria goes next? Why do we need the voices of culturally and linguistically diverse people, of queer people, of women? Why is this so important?
It is so important because it has to be a true reflection of our society in those decision-making positions. And I think being someone who is a representative, not just in Parliament, but a representative of my community more broadly and my queer community as well, having that lived experience and sharing those stories is pivotal to not only creating understanding, but also, I guess, connection with community. And it's really important for decision makers to hear from those people with lived experience as well. So elevating those voices is so, so important. And obviously, we don't want a parliament full of, stuffy people who are not those that we see when we go and do our shopping, when we go and drop our kids off at school, when we go down to the beach, when we go for a bike ride. You know, they're the people that we want to see who are speaking to us and representing us as a community and creating society.
Yeah, it shouldn't really shock people that with a diverse, vibrant culture, that we also need diverse, vibrant representation. I think that's why we see a disproportionate amount of incarcerations for people of color and things like that. Because ultimately, the police that are arresting them don't have that diversity. The parliaments that are making the laws don't have that diversity. So it is really great to see a growing and expanding range of perspectives. Whether you agree with everyone or not, Parliament is becoming a more diverse place. I just absolutely love the work that Georgie Purcell does. As someone who is, a carnivore and someone who, hasn't thought about a lot of her perspectives, she has retrained me to think differently about a lot of things like pigeons. I used to think pigeons were annoying. And then, she does this post about how beautiful they are and how important they are to ecosystems. And then I have
Yes.
these pigeons, raise a little family in my backyard, and all of a sudden I'm not annoyed at them anymore. And my day is actually better for it. And so, even
100%.
if someone might have different views, they might live a little differently to you, maybe, has a different lifestyle, there's always something we can learn from each other. And I'm really glad to see, that diversity grow. And I can only hope that it does more, that we don't regress into needing to hear more old white guys in suits.
Yeah, and I think it is like, we were talking about polarization earlier. It is in those that are in positions of power best interest to have you disconnected, to have you fighting with each other, to have you in this position where it's us and them. Now, we have much more in common than we do have distance apart. And to see each other as individuals, but also as a community. And how are you contributing to your community? I think there's this real othering going on more often than not, particularly on social media. It's a wild beast to tame, really. And I don't even know if you'd want to tame it. It's, I guess, the evolution of where we're going and how we're speaking to one another in certain realms, I suppose. But particularly when it comes to those positions of power, they want you to stay confused. They want you to not understand how the system works. Don't let them do that to you. Get yourself educated. Understand who your representatives are. Vote for those people who are going to represent you locally because that's where you can have the greatest influence. How are they going to represent you and your needs in your community? Not necessarily who's going to run the country, but who's going to be your local representative.
A discussion about social media is a good segue to the next question, because while it's not specifically about what we just mentioned, I do want to raise the fact that, obviously social media is a great way for you to interact with your constituents. However, as a legalized cannabis party member, you face censorship and restriction online that most other politicians wouldn't, even some of the ones that have been proven racist. So
I know, it's appalling, isn't it? All I'm talking about is the beautiful plant.
that's it.
I mean,
How do you survive that? How do you engage with your constituents when it is so difficult to talk about cannabis and social media? How do you engage with the public about meaningful change and reform? This is a real challenge for anyone in this space.
it's really difficult because even I've had things shadow banned where I've just been wearing, or someone in the photo with me has just been wearing a shirt, much like I am today, with cannabis leaves on it. I've been flagged for things where I'm speaking, say, about anti-vilification or NDA. And the use of non-disclosure agreements for sexual assault victims, and it being classed as explicit content. I mean, Instagram and Facebook in particular are really rigorous. And once you're flagged, and you would probably find this as well, you are forever battling the bots to prove that you're not doing anything that is outside of their requirements, outside of their policy positions. I have tried a lot of different angles. I've tried to take it to the Human Rights Commission. They have identified, yes, this is actually discrimination based on you being a member of parliament. Even sometimes my speeches in parliament are shadow banned. So it really limits my ability to do my job and to share information more widely. And I'd love to share more on social media because it is accessible. It does allow for translation. It does do interpretations of different languages. It puts subtitles on. It's free generally. And so it's really accessible. And that's what we want people to be able to have access to information, and particularly around politics. But I find it's really difficult in the way of, you can see other political parties or other members of parliament talking about very much the same thing as what you're trying to talk about and not having an issue at all. So we are trying a few different angles. I do have to somewhat limit myself. I might have to put some flags on when I say cannabis. I can't spell the word cannabis. We might have to blip it out. We sort of got creative of I'm living a plant-based lifestyle. But you then face criticisms from some of your followers in the community because they find they can smoke a bong online and have no issue. I would love to be able to do that, but
Hey, I'm not
no.
stopping you.
I'm more of a vape girl now anyway, but um, it's incredibly frustrating because, as I said, it's the most accessible way of communicating with people, and it's about having that reach. I will continue to try and work with the parameters of social media, but what I guess rely on is that people share content, and we are a grassroots party. We're a grassroots movement, and we rely on people sort of spreading that word, having those conversations. And you and I have talked about this before. Often it's about those conversations you have around the Christmas dinner table with the uncle and auntie, where you find people actually are really open to the topic because we've all done a really good job of getting the word cannabis out in the media more broadly. There's not a week goes by where it's not in the paper in some
Yeah.
way, shape, or form. It's not on social media. There's someone always talking about it. So, which is wonderful. And that really does change hearts and minds. And that ability to share your own personal story as well is, I think, is really important. It's really powerful, and it resonates with people that the laws as they currently stand are not only stigmatizing, but they're hurting our most vulnerable. And that's where we really need to showcase those stories for people to understand. And we know that 80% of Australians support regulation of cannabis, or that cannabis should no longer be considered a criminal offence. We know that people support that. I think that, social media it's a difficult one, but we continue to try and navigate it.
Well, speaking of grassroots, this is a nice segue to my next question about how it is to have Fiona Patten back on the scene. Coming into the Legalise Cannabis Party from a sex party fame. This is truly grassroots coming together.
Right,
Sorry, terrible
right.
joke there. But
Oh my God, I
I,
loved it.
I absolutely adore Fiona. Victorians adore Fiona for the work that she's done on progressive
Yeah.
causes, that many of which the Victorian Labor government get credit for, but wouldn't have happened without her. So how does it
Hmm.
feel to know that, someone who's been a mentor of yours, someone you've worked with, closely, how does it feel to have her back in the fray for a potential Senate run next year?
Fiona is a formidable advocate in the cannabis space. And if anyone can handle Canberra, it is Fiona. And I think she's never shied away from admitting to the fact that she likes a joint to relax. I love that. I think it's so important that if you are, I've seen some members of parliament advocating for, oh, I'd like to have a brownie on a Friday night. And I'm just not convinced, mate. Like, I'm not convinced.
Not
So,
fooling anyone.
um, but Fiona fought hard in her 2 years of parliament, and we know that she started the traction that has meant that I'm able to now step in and continue that good work today. She was the first to get driving on the table for patients, for medicinal cannabis patients, which started the process around the bill that was introduced. We just replicated Fiona's bill. She created the roundtable and the working group that was established that sort of informed a lot of those initial policy positions. But most importantly, she also headed up the first inquiry into the use of cannabis, which I have, as you can see, it's in the background here. Those who are listening in from home, It is the Inquiry into the Use of Cannabis in Victoria report. I have it firmly on my desk here. It is something I look at probably at least daily, if not weekly. It is like the Bible for what we're trying to achieve, and nothing much has changed in there that we can continue on that good work. So Fiona coming on board is amazing. I wish her all the success. Get behind her campaign, support her. She has not only represented all of us as cannabis consumers, but also the cannabis industry more broadly. I would say that she's been on the front foot when it has come to medicinal cannabis, the industry, how the industry is operating. Is the legislation federally fit for purpose? Fiona would argue it's not. And where is the industry going more broadly? And I know that Fiona has been very vocal in this space and she knows it back the front. So if you're looking for someone who's not only going to be a great collaborator, a great negotiator, but also a really fun person, she's your gal. Yeah.
We have plenty more to talk about when it comes to cannabis and kind of looking forward and looking ahead about what's to come. There's even some listener questions that I'd like to go through. But before we continue this conversation, I do want to take a little break for, classic Give Toke quiz. On the last show, you did Pain on Pain, which was any kind of reference to the word pain that I could find in popular culture. Now, I've got to admit, I wasn't as creative on this one. I got the name of the quiz and then I kind of had to work backwards. But this quiz is called Rachel Profiling.
Ooh.
And in this quiz, you will determine through the hint that I give you which famous person, whether it be an actor or, character, is named Rachel. So there are 7 Rachels that we're going to learn about today. I'll give you the hint, I'll give you the options, and you tell me if you know the Rachel.
Okay. Sounds good.
Question 1 on Rachel Profiling. This Rachel is an actor best known for her role on the TV series The OC. She also starred in the movies Jumper and The Last Kiss. Is it Rachel Weisz, Rachel Bilson, or Rachel Walker?
Rachel Bilson, I think.
That is
correct. You know your early 2000s cheesy teen TV. Very nice.
Yes, I do, admittedly.
Look, on it, I ain't going to lie. I used to rush to watch The OC when I was a teenager. So, yeah, no shame here. Question 2. This Rachel is an Australian actor raised in Melbourne and was a supporting actor in Muriel's Wedding, among many other things. Is it Rachel Griffin, Rachel Griffiths, or Rachel Gryffindor?
Rachel Griffiths.
That is correct. Absolute
Love
star.
that film.
Yeah, it still holds up. My gosh. Whenever people talk about Toni Collette's peak, like being, an American actor kind of in Hereditary and things like that, I go all the way back to the 90s to Muriel's Wedding. She's terrible. Question 3. This Rachel is a fictional character portrayed by Jennifer Aniston on the popular TV series Friends. Is it Rachel Tribbiani, Rachel Buffet, or Rachel Green?
Rachel Green.
That is correct.
Which could also be a good name for you if you ever need a stage name.
Well, interestingly, that's my mother's maiden name. Green.
No way.
So,
That
yes.
is awesome.
Yes.
Tom Forrest, who I have had on the show, his obviously Forrest is an incredible name for a cultivator, but his mum's maiden name is Woods, so he was always destined for that.
Shout out to you, Tom. Love your work.
Hell yeah. All right, you're killing it. You know your Rachel profiling well. Question 4. This Rachel is an actor best known for her movies The Notebook, The Time Traveler's Wife, and Sherlock Holmes. Is it Rachel Weisz, Rachel Ray, or Rachel McAdams?
I think that's Rachel McAdams.
Killing
That
it.
is correct.
That is correct indeed. All right, next one. Question 5. This Rachel is an actor most known for her roles in The Babysitter's Club, Josie and the Pussycats, and She's All That. Is it Rachel Lee Cook, Rachel Nee Cooked, or Rachel Weisz?
I think it's Rachel Lee Cook.
That is correct.
That is correct.
Big time crush, when I was a young man.
Oh, yeah.
Absolute
Great
babe.
show. Great movie. Yeah.
Okay. This Rachel is an actor best known for her movies The Mummy, The Mummy Returns, and Agora. Is it Rachel Portman, Rachel Weisz, or Rachel Berry?
Rachel Weisz. And what a babe.
That is
Big time,
correct.
big time. Actually, this is just like a massive list of people I had a crush on when I was a young man. So, hey, Rachel Weisz.
The Rachel factor.
That's it. You're all massive babes. Okay, this one's a weird one. We're finishing it off. You're 6 from 6, so there's nothing to lose here.
Oh.
This one's about etymology. Originating in Hebrew, the name Rachel means what? Female sheep, female donkey, or female camel?
Oh my goodness, I don't know this one. I feel like I've heard you being used before, which is sheep.
That is correct indeed. A female sheep / a ewe. That the Hebrew word Rachel, that's what that means. Now, a female donkey is called Jenny. So there's something going on here with women's names. And a female camel is called a cow. So I'm not going to make a comment there.
No.
But Rachel profiling, 7 out of 7. You absolutely killed it. Well done.
Thank you.
All right, moving forward and kind of looking forward, we've had some time to reflect on the last 2 years. We've spoken about challenges within your electorate, kind of the importance of underrepresented groups and women having voice. Let's look at what's coming ahead. You know, we obviously hope that Fiona Patten is going to be in the Senate come, May next year.
We do.
Where do you see yourself making the biggest impact in the coming year? I mean, earlier in this episode, you said there's some stuff you want to talk about with personal use. What's coming in 2025?
Yeah, let's get into it. Personal use, my favorite topic. I would love to be able to grow my own plants in my backyard without any fear of the police sticking their head over the fence and saying you can't do that. Personal use. So as anyone listening at home would know, we have a private members bill before Parliament, which is around regulation of personal use. So the ability to be able to grow, we've said 6 plants at home, the ability to possess small quantities in public, the ability to have something at home, and the ability to gift cannabis, because we know a lot of people do grow for other people. What we saw was that the debate brought up a lot of interesting conversations. And I think it was when Jacinta Allan was not long first elected, and there was members of Parliament asked, have you ever consumed cannabis? And bless the Premier for actually being honest and saying, yes, I have. And I think 5 years ago, if a Premier had said that, she'd be asked for her letter of resignation.
Yeah,
But
there'd be a spill.
quickly after that came out the Treasurer, or former Treasurer now, Tim Pallas, to say, yes, he had also consumed cannabis. And it turned into quite a spectacle of a day where we had about a third of members of Parliament admitting to using cannabis, which is a great analogy for the fact that a third of Australians have used cannabis at one point in their life. The debate went really quite well, I think. Most people in that space said, we need more evidence. Look, we know that Fiona Patten headed up an inquiry and there is plenty of evidence there. The government has never responded to that. They were required to respond in February 2022, I believe. So reset on that, we thought, well, we'll put a petition forward in Parliament, which we gutted about 3,000 signatures in the space of 2 or 3 days, which was for, we want to have another debate about personal use. What came of that was the Minister, Ingrid Stitt, who's the Minister for Mental Health, where cannabis falls into that portfolio, said, we're amenable to talking about harm minimisation. We're amenable to looking at the evidence. So I continue to say, well, I've got this bill here for you. Just support it. It's wonderful. It's great. They weren't willing to do that just yet. But what they have been willing to do is let us take it to a bill review. It's a short, sharp review of the bill, but included in that, we'll also look at the ACT and the impacts of decriminalisation, because it has been since 2020. It has been nearly 4 or 5 years. There has been a statutory review which has said that nothing major has happened, apart from the fact that 90% of arrest rates have reduced for cannabis use. So we'll be heading to the ACT in February. We'll be doing a public hearing in February as well early next year, and there will be a report and recommendations handed up to Parliament in May, the 18th of May, I believe it has to be in by. I'm expecting those recommendations will say, hopefully, that cannabis should be regulated, that we should be allowing personal use, we should be treating it as a health issue, but also reflecting on the previous inquiry and looking at the fact that there is options there for making sure young people are protected and education is paramount. Looking at options for what has happened in the ACT around allowing people to send in samples of their homegrown to have it tested. So looking at the profiles of plants, not just CBD, THC, terpenes, but also is there any mold? Is there any lead in your soil? Keeping people safe. And I actually asked when the drug checking service was being discussed, I raised that, well, are we going to be able to test plant matter as well? Because I think it's really important. We want people to be safe, and we don't necessarily know what we're purchasing if we're purchasing it from the black market. They said no, and that's only because the machinery doesn't have that capability. But the legislation doesn't exclude there from being that sort of testing. So this is a really good thing, and where we're stepping forward here. But I actually feel as though the government may be ready to start talking about what personal use looks like going forward. And we know that currently Pennington Institute is doing a review and looking at regulation more broadly. I know that there has been quite a bit of feedback around that in the sense that they don't ask any questions around personal use or growing your own at home. I think that they would probably have a position of if it was, regulated or decriminalized, that would be part of that. But it'll be interesting to see what they're sort of producing. And there's so many moving parts here. There's things like Pennington Institute are doing their good work. We're doing our work here in Parliament. There's a lot going on in the advocacy space more broadly. And I think that the state government is also going, we've got a huge deficit here. And is there an opportunity to not only just save money by not having it a criminal offence anymore, and the amount of policing that is spent on persecuting people for cannabis is ridiculous, but should we be looking at reform more broadly? And I actually think that this is just my personal opinion, is that the government wouldn't be ready just to go into full legalization. That will take time, and we want to make sure it's done properly. We all have our favorite models. I think that there's a cherry picking from a few different models. There's probably a way that is most appropriate for Australian regulation going forward. But paramount to what I want to achieve next year is to stop arresting our people. And those that are being arrested, we're still seeing about 9,000 a year arrested, are young people, are people from culturally diverse and linguistically diverse backgrounds, are Aboriginal people, and particularly Aboriginal women. We don't want to see people ending up in jail for something as silly as possession, personal use of cannabis. So let's go for it. That's sort of where I'm at with this. And we've got a good working relationship with the government. It's just up to them, I suppose, if they're brave enough to do that. And I think with what's happened with drug checking services, and the fact that there has been a really good community response to that, we may hopefully see that there's the same sort of rhetoric and the same sort of motivation there to say, we're almost at 100 years of failed policy, failed legislation. Prohibition does not work. How can we approach this better? So that's probably my biggest goal going forward for next year and the next 2 years more broadly.
Just a small little task there, just no biggie, just, regulation and legalization of personal use. It's super exciting. And I think, we're at a time where I believe the media conversation is better than it's ever been. People will talk about the fact that the last couple of months there's been some negative press about the medicinal cannabis industry, but I really think the response has been incredibly positive and mature. It's like, hey, there are some issues to address. Let's address them. It's not this kind of reefer madness kind of what's the word, moral outrage, moral panic kind of response. I think it's more mature than it's ever been. The Greens presented a bill federally. Like you said, cherry pick some things out of that. I didn't like that bill. Two things can be possible. I love David Shoebridge, but I didn't like that bill. I don't think we need an Amsterdam style model. There are certain things and certain ideas that we can take from and hopefully bring a reality to. Even Pennington, I think they understand their audience, but it's a far more conservative model for regulation and legalization than what I would personally support. But I'm not one to let perfect be the enemy of good. So it's
100%.
It's great to see all these different moving parts. Let's hope those moving parts kind of work a little bit more together.
Yeah. And another thing that's sort of happening next year is that we did the workplace drug testing inquiry this year. And, I mentioned earlier that the government has 6 months to respond to. When you do an inquiry, there's a report and recommendations made. So those responses are due in February next year as well. So workplace drug testing is a huge issue for medicinal cannabis patients. And we'd love to see that that is reflected in not only sort of redevelopment of what WorkSafe is doing and those practices there, but also looking at how do we protect people and how do we protect people's, access to their medication. And it could be the fact that, one of the recommendations made was that there'd be uh, a change to the Charter of Human Rights to acknowledge the fact that patients should be able to access medication and it should not impact their ability to go to work. So I think that we'll probably see a bit of movement there, hopefully next year as well. We'll definitely be trying to push for that. And we do have so many people contact us who are employed or are about to be employed, have gone through all the process of employment and get to a medical and are told, oh no, we can't hire you because you use medicinal cannabis. So it's an ongoing issue and something that we will be continuing to champion.
You and David, Jeremy, Brian, you guys all work really hard for this cause and, for the other concerns of people in your electorate. Someone, or something I don't see contributing to the kind of this level of work, and, you've mentioned you're a medicinal patient.
Yeah.
Where is the support from the industry? Is this something that, you're seeing any of, enough of? Is this something you want more of? Because when I speak to industry people, they talk about their concern, that they're tentative, that they've got to dance around the government and regulations. But I find it
Mm.
to be a little feckless at times, a little spineless. So what's
Hmm.
been your experience getting support from the industry that you are advocating so much for?
I think particularly when it came to the driving trial and trying to move forward with how do we collaborate with industry on getting an outcome that is about caring for our patients, I was really disappointed that the industry was fairly silent when it came to that. Who is standing up for patients' rights? I know that I am. I know that David Ettershank is. I know that Brian Walker and Jeremy Buckingham are. And there are many good players in the industry who are doing that. But if you're doing a telehealth appointment for 2 to 3 minutes, are you really having a conversation with a patient about how they are understanding what laws that they are now going to be interacting with or what risks they may be taking as a patient? And where is the duty of care, would be what I would say. So I highly encourage the industry to start being more proactive in working with different levels of government, different advocacy bodies. I think it's all very well and good to be offering a product and a service, but where is your social responsibility to your patients?
I couldn't agree more. I recall it must have been a year or two ago, Drive Change did a GoFundMe to raise $75,000 for the campaign to end
Yep.
discrimination for cannabis patients. There was a $5,000 donation from one company, but the rest of the
Mm.
donations were from patients. And that GoFundMe has not made
Wow.
it. It's at 23,000 of $75,000. It's not happening. That should have instantly been solved by industry. I know that $5,000 cash might be a lot to some people, to some boutique cultivators, to some growers that haven't made money in 3 years. But when I
Mm.
see the millions of dollars being thrown around in other regards, when I see the thousands of dollars being thrown around at, pre-drinks for award ceremonies, you kind of
Yep.
go, hey, put your money where your mouth is. Put your money where your patients' livelihoods are.
Right.
People are risking their livelihoods every day driving to work after consuming cannabis safely the night before. You're happy to take our $150 a tub, but are you going to support us when when the going gets tough? And the answer, unfortunately, has been no. I know people that want to try medicinal cannabis that will not until the driving laws change. They're missing customers, even if they just want to look at it like that. So it's been
Totally.
incredibly disappointing to see that lack of support. And I think you're quite diplomatic in your request for more support for them. But I'm going to say it, motherfuckers, cash up. Get some cash. Be a little bit more vocal. I
Yeah.
know that you're scared of the TGA. I know you're scared of the ODC. But if you're willing to be in business in this space, advocate for the people that are making you the money.
100%. And I think it's also just to give a shout out to B Muhammad. You mentioned David Helpin earlier. They have been, many of the voices behind Drive Change, that movement, and the formidable work that they did in that space. It's exhausting being an advocate and continuing to say we're representing patients. I have referred so many patients to Drive Change for support. It would be a drop in the ocean, as you said, for some of these bigger players. And what really concerns me is that I feel like as a community, we're pretty supportive and we're pretty ethical, but these sorts of practices just make me feel as though there's only one motivation here, and it's not necessarily in the best interests of who they're meant to be representing. And, we can talk till the cows come home on this, but it is time that we all work together as an industry. And I think that there's often this argument that, social cannabis is different to medicinal cannabis. No, it's not. It's all the same. If we had cannabis regulated in this country tomorrow, all of those players would be definitely interested in being part of that industry. A lot of the product that is grown here in Australia is sold overseas as either social cannabis or medicinal cannabis. A lot of what's imported here is medicinal cannabis, is social cannabis overseas. It's all the same plant. We need to all collaborate and work together on making sure that our industry is fit for purpose, is responsible, but also keeping it Australian as well is so important to me. And that's one of my biggest fears is if we do end up with a legalized model, and it's not if, but when we end up with a legalized model, I don't want to just see internationals coming in and taking over. And you and I have both been to Thailand and seen the impact that that has had. They've scaled a lot of their regulation back and are now looking at how do we best support our local industry. And also shout out to Kitty Chopika, who you've had on the program before. What an amazing advocate. When I was in Thailand last, Kitty was on a hunger strike with all the other cannabis growers, and they have pushed for the fact that there needs to be a regulated legal industry there, but it needs to be supporting the local industry and bolstering their local growers as well as their dispensaries. So,
Well, even Canada, who have a very flawed model of legalization that does work in many many senses, have ensured that it's Canadian cannabis only. You can't even get American cannabis in Canada, and so it can be done. We can protect our industry. We can incentivize it. We
yeah.
can make it flourish and thrive. So very exciting. Cannabis cultivators, cannabis companies here, B2Bs, all you guys, please step up and promote this cause with some cash
Yeah.
and with some more advocacy. So, Rachel, I've got a couple more questions of my own before we dive into the listener questions, but I'm wondering, because I think this is a nice little connection, how do you stay motivated when the work becomes difficult or discouraging? There's been such a roller coaster with drug driving alone. There's so many things that you must have to kind of cop on the chin, move on, pivot, as you mentioned, deal with. How do you stay motivated?
Really good question. And it is incredibly difficult sometimes to stay motivated because you do feel like you are either preaching to the choir or you are up against these major barriers where they just, have that catch all phrase of no cannabis causes mental health issues. Well, let's break that down. Let's have those further conversations. But for me, it's cannabis and cats. So,
Oh, we're kindred spirits, you and I.
oh, if it wasn't for my darling Chiquitita and Minnie and, being able to also be a consumer of cannabis, I don't think I could relax as I am able to do. I also am so blessed to live where I do. You mentioned, I now live in the South-East and I do have the bay at my doorstep. So I spend a lot of time going down to the water. I've been doing the cold water swims, really good fun, really invigorating. And I've also got a really supportive partner, which I think I definitely couldn't do the work I do without her. So, she's my darling, and I really appreciate all the love and support that she's able to give me. But some of the bigger motivators for me, I think, is always going back to the cannabis community and talking to those people who got me here. And inspired me to be here because what I realize is that I'm elevating their cause by talking about my experiences and giving them a voice where they don't feel comfortable saying it. So I'm more than happy to continue to do that. And, my motivation here is make me redundant, just legalize cannabis and I'm out of a job. So I'll move on to my next thing. So
That is
yeah.
one of the great things about those of you in the legalized cannabis party. You actually don't want to be in a job. It's like, hey, I want my work to be done. Yeah, off I go into the sunset.
Yeah, yeah. You couldn't be. I don't know how people could be a politician long term or a career politician. It's such hard work and it's taxing. You do a lot of traveling. You speak to a lot of people. You use a lot of energy, but it's really rewarding and it's a job like no other. And I get to work with some incredible people. I get to speak to people who I would never get to speak to in ordinary life, and that's some of the most motivating things that can be possible in this space.
It's refreshing to hear your appreciation for the role, unlike Senator Ralph Babbitt, who thinks that it's a step down from his real estate career, and we should be grateful that he's even doing it. So
we're coming for him next, don't you worry.
Please.
The $100 million man.
Yeah. Rachel, if you could change one thing about the political system, what would it be and why?
Oh, just one thing?
yes. We've only
I've got
time.
Three. Yeah, okay.
Oh, you've got three, please.
One would be definitely political donations and influence on major parties. Despise it. Another would be, I really hate waste. And during election campaign time, we've all had to line up to vote. You are flooded with call flus. You're flooded with bits of paper after bits of paper. I do not know why they haven't just said, everyone, there's a QR code, scan it to have a look at our policy positions, our how to vote cards, whatever it is that you want to showcase on the day. Stop wasting paper, stop wasting people's time and those resources. Most people have made up their minds and they're spending time on their phone anyway when they're standing in line. And finally, a pet peeve of mine is that in Victoria, the government of the day does not support private members' bills. Now, Victoria is the only state where the government has a long-standing policy of not supporting private members' bills. And it frustrates me. So I have written to the Premier and said some of the best legislation that has ever been has been a private member's bill, and I'm thinking of voluntary assisted dying. I'm thinking of marriage equality. Many of our most fundamental rights are sparked through a private member's bill, including cannabis reform in the ACT. It was a private member's bill from the Labor Party member. I would love to see that position change, because although they're not supported greatly in other jurisdictions, there is maybe 5 to 10% that there is support for, and they along the political spectrum, they could be anything from something that may be considered quite forward thinking or progressive through to something that is, more of a nuts and bolts piece of legislation. So there is no rhyme or reason to it, and I think that the government of the day needs to maybe take the reins off and let a few of us have a bit more freedom in that space and get on with our jobs, really.
All very common sense suggestions, and I really appreciate your kind of common sense approach to politics in general. I'm going to end with some listener questions here. These were submitted via Instagram just about a week ago. I must apologize. I very lazily did not record the names of the people that asked these questions, but I certainly did record the questions. But we'll kick off with some of these, and some of them connect to things we've already spoken about, and some of them are quite interesting. So the first one is, how has this work impacted your relationships?
Oh, good question. It has definitely been something I've had to navigate. And as I mentioned before, I'm really blessed to have such a supportive partner, but it's taken us to have really good communication. We sit down and do a regular, like, monthly catch up where we do have a bit of an agenda of things we need to talk about. And this often comes up. My job is hard and it's taxing, and I come home in all sorts of moods sometimes. So yeah, it has impacted my relationships, not just my personal relationships, but I don't get to see my friends as much anymore, if at all. And I just make sure that quality time that I do have with those that I am dear with and my family and friends is quality time, and I'm really present.
A common thread in this show with my guests, people working in cannabis more so than politics, is how essential the support of family and partnership is. I can speak to that greatly. I'm blessed with an amazingly understanding and supportive wife, and I don't think anything that kind of takes a little bit of risk could be achieved without the support and love of others. You certainly couldn't do it with the criticism of the people closest to you. So it's great to then have explicit, unconditional love and support.
It is, yeah. It is.
Next question. If David Ettershank were a type of cannabis product, what would he be?
Oh, wow. Oh, that's such a good one. I mean, yeah. If he was a type of cannabis product, he would definitely be a sativa.
Yep.
He would definitely be something that was like really, really chill.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm thinking a nice long, because he's tall, a nice long and skinny joint of mango haze is David Ettershank in cannabis form.
Oh, that sounds about right. Yeah, definitely a joint. Yes. And yeah, a nice 3 papery. Yeah.
What about you? This wasn't submitted, but what about you?
I love anything with mimosa. So
Oh,
I
nice.
had a beautiful experience again. Shout out to Kitty. I acquired some cannabis from her dispensary and was swimming in a pool where we were overlooking sort of a cliff face. And I remember thinking, I think I know why it's called Monkey Mountain now, because I could see monkey faces sort of in the cliff faces. And it was just so uplifting and so creative. I love anything with mimosa. I like uplifting. I use cannabis to relax for sure, but I also like to be social when I'm using cannabis. So something that helps me enjoy nature and helps me spend time with those that I adore.
Very nice. Well, David Ettershank is Mango Haze. You are Mimosa. That sounds absolutely delightful. Next question. How would you describe your style in Parliament? Now, I'm assuming this is interpersonal style rather than fashion. I mean, we already know that you're outstandingly fashionable. So how would you describe your interpersonal style in Parliament?
Oh, definitely collaborative. I would say creative as well and compassionate.
And our final listener question, I definitely don't know where this one came from. Out of all your appearances on various podcasts, which was your favorite and why was it Give Toke?
It was actually. I think that you have the ability to make someone very comfortable very quickly, and we have really engaging conversation. I really enjoy the way you communicate as well. I could listen to you speak all day. So yeah, it's definitely give and toke.
I just meant to get a laugh out of that one, not actually a heartfelt response. So thank you for, ending our show on such a lovely note. Rachel, as we prepare to wrap up, is there anything
Yeah.
else we kind of haven't covered? Anything else that, you think you want to get out there that I missed in this absolutely delightful conversation?
I think it's just reflecting on the last 2 years and the encouragement and support that I have received from the majority of people who do engage with me. Continue to do so. It really does keep me motivated. It really helps, and I'm greatly appreciative of it. So let's keep going. This is grassroots and let's keep motivating each other and pushing forward. Social media is not going to stop us.
There's the Newcastle coming out. Your grassroots as. I absolutely love it. Rachel, I adore you. I adore the work you do. I'm so grateful for the gratitude that you have for the role that you're in. I have described you on another podcast as one of the most important people for cannabis legalization in this country, and I still firmly
Oh,
believe that.
wow.
You are a huge
Wow.
asset for everything we're trying to do. Thank you so much for everything, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Paul. And look, it's 4:20.
Holy shit. Blaze it. And if we miss this, we can never smoke weed again. Isn't that the rule?
That's right. That's right. Speaking of, we will have 420 in the park over Easter. So remember, we need everyone to come out and be supportive of the cause. It's a big day for us.
Absolutely. No, good to get that word out now because, yeah, people start to make Easter plans. I will
Mm.
be blazing in the park.
Mm-hmm. Let's do it.
Thanks again, Rachel.
Pleasure.